There are moments in life when the mind forgets, but the heart refuses to obey. On a quiet morning wrapped in pale sunlight, CEO Toan sat alone by a wooden table that no longer belonged to his past. The room was small, modest, and filled with the scent of boiled rice and old wood. Nothing like the glass towers and leather chairs he once owned, though he did not remember them now. His memory had vanished like mist after rain, leaving behind only fragments of unfamiliar days and a lingering emptiness he could never explain. Toan had learned to live with that emptiness. Each morning he woke, worked, ate, and rested like any ordinary man. He carried sacks, wiped sweat from his brow, and shared silent meals with an elderly woman who had taken him in when he collapsed by the roadside. Life moved forward in small, repetitive steps, simple, honest, and painfully quiet. And yet something inside him always felt unfinished, as if his soul were waiting for a name it could no longer pronounce. That morning, everything changed. While helping sort through old belongings, Toan's fingers brushed against a creased photograph. The paper was worn, the edges softened by time, but the image remained painfully clear. A young woman stood there, her eyes gentle yet filled with unspoken sorrow. She was not smiling, yet her presence radiated warmth, as if she had once been someone's entire world. Toan's breath caught. He did not recognize her face, but his heart reacted before his mind could intervene. A sharp ache bloomed in his chest, sudden and overwhelming. His hands trembled, his vision blurred. For reasons he could not understand, the room seemed to shrink, and the silence grew unbearably loud. "Who is she?" he whispered, though no one answered. Images rushed toward him like broken waves, rain falling on a quiet street, a woman waiting under a dim streetlight, a promise left unfinished. None of it was clear, yet every fragment carried the same unbearable emotion: longing. Outside, life continued as usual. Neighbors swept their yards, motorbikes passed by. Somewhere a kettle boiled. Ordinary days moved on, unaware that in one small room, a heart was awakening from a long sleep. Toan pressed the photo to his chest, feeling something stirred deep within him, a pull towards somewhere, someone he could not name. For the first time since losing his memory, he felt a direction, fragile but undeniable. He did not know where he was meant to return to, but his heart already did. And somewhere far away, Tu Diem felt it too. An ache without reason, a hope she had never truly let go. The story had begun long before memory failed, and fate quietly was preparing to bring them back together.
Some encounters happen without words, yet they leave scars deeper than memory. After that morning, the photograph never left Toan's side. He folded it carefully, slipping it into the inner pocket of his worn shirt, as if afraid it might disappear the way his past had. He did not know the woman's name, but she followed him everywhere, in the rhythm of his footsteps, in the weight of each breath, in the silence that settled between one thought and the next. Work became harder to focus on. As he lifted heavy sacks and wiped sweat from his face, his mind wandered to questions he could not answer. Who was she? Why did her eyes look as though they had been waiting for him for a lifetime? And why did his chest tighten every time he imagined her standing alone somewhere, looking at an empty phone screen? In the evenings, when the sky turned the color of ash and gold, Toan would sit by the doorway of the small farmhouse. The elderly woman busied herself with cooking, humming softly, unaware of the storm quietly unfolding inside him. Toan stared into the distance, where the road stretched on like an unfinished sentence. He felt an urge to follow it, to walk until something inside him made sense again. Everyday life mirrored his confusion, just like people who forget their umbrellas on rainy days or search endlessly for keys already in their hands. Toan lived with a constant sense of almost remembering. The memory hovered just out of reach, teasing him with warmth and pain in equal measure. That night, sleep refused to come easily. When it did, it carried him into dreams he had never lived, yet somehow knew. He saw a woman standing in a crowded place, her shoulders tense, her lips pressed together in quiet strength. He saw himself turning back, wanting to say something important, but the world between them collapsed into darkness before the words could escape. Toan woke with his heart racing. He sat up, gripping the edge of the bed, breathing as though he had run a long distance. The photo slipped from his pocket and landed on the floor. Under the pale moonlight, the woman's face seemed almost alive, close enough to touch, far enough to lose again. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing why. The next day, he found himself asking questions he had never dared to ask before. He listened more carefully to conversations around him, watched faces more closely, searching for familiarity in strangers. A quiet determination began to grow, soft but steady, like a seed pushing through the soil. Somewhere, a truth was waiting. Somewhere, a woman named Tu Diem was living her days with the same unanswered ache, waking up, working, smiling when required, and crying when no one could see. She did not know that a forgotten man was holding her photograph close to his heart, fighting against time, fate, and his own broken memory. Between them, distance remained, but the pull grew stronger with every passing day, and fate, patient and relentless, was slowly closing the space in between. Sometimes the heart walks ahead, leaving the mind struggling to catch up. The days that followed felt strangely heavier, as if the air itself carried unspoken secrets. Toan continued his work, hands roughened by labor, shoulders aching beneath the sun. Yet beneath the physical exhaustion lay a deeper fatigue, one born from longing without a name. Each morning, as he stepped onto the dusty road, he instinctively checked his pocket, reassured only when his fingers brushed against the folded photograph. Ordinary moments began to stir something unusual inside him. The sound of laughter from passing workers made him pause. A woman tying her hair by the roadside sent a brief shock through his chest. Even the scent of warm rice drifting from nearby houses filled him with a sense of loss so sharp it almost brought him to his knees. These were fragments of a life he could not remember, yet somehow recognized. At night, the memories grew bolder. Not clear images, never complete, but emotions. The feeling of waiting, the fear of being too late, the quiet promise of returning no matter how far he had gone. He dreamt of running through rain, of calling out a name that vanished on his tongue, of reaching for a hand just as it slipped away. Each dream ended the same way, with his heart pounding and his eyes wet, though he did not remember crying. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Tu Diem lived her own quiet struggle. She moved through her days like countless others, working, eating, resting, yet everything felt slightly out of place. She kept checking her phone, even when she knew there would be no missed calls. She held on to hope the way one holds on to an old habit, painful yet impossible to abandon. She sensed it too, the invisible tug, the feeling that something long lost was slowly circling back. One afternoon, Toan overheard a conversation at a small roadside stall. Two men spoke casually about missing persons, about photos posted at police stations, about families waiting endlessly for news. His chest tightened. Without fully understanding why, he leaned closer, his heartbeat quickening with each word. That evening, he made a decision. It was not loud or dramatic. It arrived quietly, like dusk settling over the fields. He could no longer remain where he was, pretending this ache would fade. The photograph was no longer just a picture. It was a direction, a call, a promise he felt bound to answer. As he stood beneath the fading sky, wind brushing against his face, Toan whispered again, this time with resolution. "I'm coming." He did not know where the road would lead, or what truth awaited him at the end of it. He only knew that his heart had already chosen. And when the heart remembers, no distance is truly far.
Some reunions do not arrive with thunder or tears at first. They arrive softly, like a breath held for too long, finally released. The morning Toan decided to leave, the sky was unusually clear. No signs, no warnings, just a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had stepped aside to let fate do its work. He packed little, a change of clothes, a small sum of money, and the photograph he now guarded like a second heart. Each step away from the farm felt heavier, yet strangely right, as though he were walking towards something he had promised long ago. The journey was not heroic. It was slow, uncertain, filled with crowded buses, unfamiliar streets, and moments of doubt. Toan watched faces pass him by, people arguing on phones, couples sharing quiet smiles, strangers lost in their own worries. Ordinary life unfolded around him, and in it he saw reflections of what he had lost: connection, belonging, love. Every small scene whispered the same question: who was I to someone else? Meanwhile, Tu Diem felt the change before she understood it.
She woke with an unfamiliar restlessness, her heart beating faster for no reason she could name. The day refused to move normally. The kettle boiled too loudly. Time dragged, then suddenly rushed. She stepped outside, drawn by nothing and everything at once, feeling as though the air itself was calling her forward. When they finally crossed paths, it was painfully simple. A crowded street. A moment of hesitation. Toan stopped, frozen by a feeling so powerful it stole his breath. Tu Diem looked up, and the world narrowed to one face. No memories rushed back. No names were spoken. Yet something ancient and undeniable surged between them. Recognition without explanation. Her hands trembled. His chest tightened. The silence stretched, filled with everything they had been and everything they had lost. Tears came without permission, confusing, unstoppable. Tu Diem took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "It's you, isn't it?" Toan could not answer with words. He only knew that standing before her, the ache that had haunted him finally softened. He nodded, eyes burning, heart finally at home. In that moment, the past did not need to return all at once. It would come later, slowly, gently. What mattered was this. Fate had done what memory could not. Two lives, once torn apart by circumstance, had found their way back, not through certainty, but through longing. And sometimes, that is enough to begin again.